Good evening, everybody, and members of the public gallery too. Good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Eastern Planning Committee. My name is Penny Rivers and I chair this meeting. I'm asking everyone to keep statements brief and to the point, and speeches will be timed this evening. An alarm will sound when you've spoken for 4 minutes. To be eligible to vote, councillors, you have to be in the room and hear the entire debate. I'm sure we will be having some loo breaks in the evening. Agenda item number 1, apologies for absence and substitutions. Louise, are there any?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies have been received from Councillors John Gray and Liz Townsend. Councillor Henry is present as a substitute for Councillor Gray, and Councillor Follows is present as a substitute for Councillor Townsend.
Thank you. Agenda item number 2, minutes of the last meeting. Members, do you confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 6th of April?
Agree.
Thank you. Agenda item number 3, declarations of interest. Do we have any?
None received before the meeting, Chairman.
Thank you. Questions from members of the public. Louise, are there any?
None received, Chairman.
Thank you. And questions from members, are there any?
None received, Chairman.
Thank you. Agenda item number 6, any relevant updates to government guidance or legislation since the last meeting. May I ask Chris to say whether there are any updates, please? Oh, sorry, Zach.
Sorry, I don't mind being usurped. I was just going to mention the levelling up and regeneration bill that has recently been published, but I think it's a bit too early for me to give any meaningful comment on that, and obviously it hasn't been enacted as yet, so it doesn't have an impact on any of the applications before us tonight. I don't know if Chris had anything prepared. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zach. Agenda item 7 and 8, just with both applications on the agenda tonight are eligible for public speaking. So let's come to the first, which is WA 2021-02002, land at Windacres Farm. And the proposal is an outline application for the erection of 37 dwellings. Kate, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and hello, members. So here we have a location plan for the proposal with the site outlined in red, and as you can see, the land to the east is within a blue line, so that is also owned by the applicant. The site is behind an existing line of houses along the B2128, which form part of the Cox Green settlement adjacent to Ridgewick, Ridgewick being within Horsham Borough. And just to clarify where the dividing line for the borough is, as you can see, this is a cross-boundary application, so the land you can see here with the site outline is within Waverley Borough, which includes the entirety of the proposed housing development, with the area in pink being within the demise of Horsham District Council, and associated with that of a different highway authority being West Sussex Highway Authority. A separate application has been made to Horsham District Council for the access, which has been granted subject to a legal agreement saying it can only be implemented in effect if consent for this application is granted. And just for orientation in terms of the photos I'm about to show you, you can see here the site at the centre of the black area with the triangular shape. Just to orientate you in terms of the public rights of way, to the right hand side of the image there you can see a yellow dashed line which is public right of way 449, and the blue dash, the purple dashed line which you can see to the bottom of the image is the Sussex border path, which is another another public right of way. Sorry, yes. I'll just wait a minute for before I continue. Thank you. Thank you, Louise. I'll continue now. So that was just to orientate in terms of the public rights of way. So the site adjoins the Sussex border path to the south there for a small section. And here we have some images of the site and surrounding area. Working anti-clockwise, the top left image there is directly opposite where the proposed entrance would be, which would be between two existing dwellings on the B2128. April Rise and Trundle Mead, where there's an existing gap in the vegetation and built form. The image to the upper right, you can see there is just along the B2128, which turns into Church Street, which is the main street going through Ridgewick, further to the south. As you can see, it has grass verges to either side and a number of residential entrance driveways. The bottom left-hand image you can see there is looking across the what I would call the blue line land, so the adjacent field owned by the same applicant, from the public right-of-way 449 towards the application site. You can just see there's a line of trees and then a gap and then a hedge. So that gap there is where the proposed access road would be, and the line of trees you can see in that image would form the boundary to the application site, and is proposed to be upgraded, as it were, with additional woodland and shrub planting to provide a landscape buffer. And finally on this slide, the right-hand lower image you can see there is of the application site as viewed from the Sussex border path in the southernmost part. As you can just see there, a crop of what I believe a bean crop has recently been planted in the field. And then just two images here. The upper one is again looking across that southernmost field, and the lower image is looking across the northern field, which is where the majority of the houses would be sited. And now looking at the proposed site plan, as you can see, the access would come in there to the north, which would be between the two existing dwellings on the B2128. There'd be a central spine road and a number of units accessed off that. Gaps would be created in the existing hedgerow between the two fields to allow the access road to go into the southern field. And as you could see, houses would be provided throughout. You can also see in this image, just to the bottom left-hand corner, the Holy Trinity Church, which is a Grade 1 listed building, the impact upon which is considered within the report. And here you can see the proposed indicative landscaping master plan, which shows areas of green, which would be effectively amenity grass space, areas of purple, which would be planted up with meadow planting, and the dark green area you can see there is a fairly significant landscape buffer, which the applicant is proposing to provide by way of a Section 106 legal agreement on the land adjacent to the application site, which is within their control. And just for orientation purposes, again, as I know a number of representations have mentioned references in the report to the Ridgewick Metals site, which is the Berkeley site in Horsham district area. So you can see that site here in green with the layout indicated, and the application site that we're considering now is outlined in red and sits to the north of that. So they aren't directly adjoining, albeit they're in the same vicinity. And the main issues for consideration are the planning balance assessment, which, as you will have seen within the recommendation, it has been a careful and considered balancing assessment on the basis of applying a tilted balance due to housing land supply, which we can obviously discuss further if you wish. And part of that planning balance assessment, we need to consider the planning history. There has been a refusal previously on the site for 57 units, and that refusal was upheld at appeal. So that scheme was dismissed, and the consideration of this scheme against the appeal scheme and the previous inspector's comments has been an intrinsic part of the assessment. There's also consideration of the principle of the development in terms of sustainability of location, the loss of agricultural land, housing mix and affordable housing, impact on landscape character and visual amenity, impact on residential amenity, biodiversity and compliance with the habitat regulations, impact on the Arran Special Protection Area, which is quite an unusual one because it's generally outside of our area, but given that this site crosses the boundary, it in effect means that we need to be able to ensure that it won't impact on the hydrology within the Arran SPA. And there's a recommended condition to address that, which would effectively control where the water to serve the development is provided from. There's also a consideration of impact on heritage assets. In relation to the inspector's decision on this point in relation to the previous scheme, he did find less than substantial harm to a number of heritage assets, including the Holy Trinity Church, which I just showed you, and the Ridgewick Conservation Area. And indeed, our heritage specialist advises that there would remain a degree of less than substantial harm in relation to those assets. But the previous inspector's conclusion was clear that he didn't consider the harm to those assets in themselves to amount to a reason for refusal in itself for the previous scheme, i.e. that the public benefits with the previous scheme outweighed any harm to the heritage assets, notwithstanding that that is always given great weight. So notwithstanding that the previous conclusion about harm to heritage assets, that does remain as a harm in the overall planning balance. Other considerations are highways and parking, drainage and flood risk, and the planning benefits of the scheme, which is obviously particularly important as part of the balancing exercise. Housing land supply is also relevant in terms of how we undertake the planning balancing exercise. As you know, currently we are slightly below the 5-year supply, which means in effect that paragraph 11 of the NPPF is engaged, so there is a tilted balance, and that is an important part of the conclusion I've reached in relation to the planning balance assessment. And obviously also for consideration are the various legal obligations associated with the proposal. And I just confirm really that I'm recommending approval, and there are just a few comments I have for you with regards to updates. Members have been provided with a copy of the appeal decision alongside the update sheet. It's not expected that members will have read the whole appeal decision, but the most relevant parts are referenced in the report. But we just felt it was prudent to provide a copy for ease of reference if it's necessary during your debate. I also have an update sheet to just update you on. We've received a number of late representations in the run-up to the meeting. So the update sheet is, I will say, it's quite lengthy and has been updated during the course of today and since the original was issued to you electronically this morning. So I'll just take you through this. So in relation to ecology, we noted that there was further information and comments from Surrey Wildlife Trust outstanding with regards to bats. Subsequently, an outline bat mitigation study has been submitted, and Surrey Wildlife Trust have come back confirming that that provides sufficient information to demonstrate that it meets the necessary tests, and that you know, we can be satisfied that there would be no harm to bats. But following on from that, there is a recommendation for 2 additional conditions to be added to protect that interest, and so those are for a bat presence or absence survey prior to reserve matters application, and for a bat sensitive lighting scheme and habitat enhancement creation plan. So there are 2 additional recommended conditions. In relation to additional neighbour representations and amenity bodies, there have been a number since the report was published. An additional 25 neighbour representations have been received, which is slightly different to the figure in the update sheet as originally circulated, including one from the Rudrick Preservation Society and CPRE. Officers considered that the main additional points raised within the additional representations are submission of an oblique aerial photograph of the site, which shows the site in relation to the border paths. Representation stating that the appeal was rejected at a time when Waverley did not have a 5-year supply. Therefore, the application is being made under comparable circumstances, and the benefits would be reduced and the harms would remain. The Berkeley development is not adjacent and should not justify the proposal. It's further south. So again, that was within the slide which we saw within the presentation. It isn't directly adjoining, but it is in the vicinity of the application site. Representations also referred to local services being further from the site than the 1.7 to 2 kilometres distance referred to in the report. That the proposal is out of keeping with the linear character which was accepted by the previous appeal inspector, that regard should be had to the Ridgewick neighbourhood plan, loss of farmland, particularly due to reliance on wheat grown in Russia and Ukraine, the development would not have sufficient parking, concerns about the height of properties, the biodiversity net gain statement isn't supported, that the owners have been using the land for a steam fair for over 5 years, that there are enough brownfield sites to fulfil the council's obligations, and that biodiversity net gain can only be achieved through loss of further agricultural fields, and therefore does not represent a benefit of the scheme. We've had an additional consultee response from Ridgewick Parish Council, who have restated their objection, strong objection. They have concerns over loss of open countryside in the AGLV, which is interspersed with numerous footpaths. They consider the location to be unsustainable, and that the development would be reliant on vehicles to access services. That Ridgewick has proactively planned for necessary housing, and it's not so constrained that the development of the site is necessary. The scheme hasn't overcome the inspector's reasons for dismissal. The planning benefits are reduced. The tilted balance has been applied by the inspector previously. That Ridgewick and Horsham would receive no sill to provide infrastructure for the development. That it would create a governance boundary issue, that the council's instructed landscape witness continues to consider that the scheme would result in landscape harm, and that the development would result in loss of an agricultural field, as there is a crop there currently. We've also today received an objection from CPRE. Their reasons for objections are in effect stating that they consider the harm would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. That the previous inspector found there was no 5-year housing land supply. The council's landscape consultant concluded that the policy conflicts remain, and the Court of Appeal has ruled that even where development plans are rendered out of date by housing land shortfalls, they remain potentially relevant, and decision makers are not legally bound to disregard policies in the development plan when applying the tilted balance. I've just got here on the update sheet, which is again an addition today, a response to a representation which I have first seen today with regards to loss of agricultural land. Effectively, both fields have previously been fallow and were at the time the application was submitted, but it's evident now that the southernmost field is planted with a bean crop. However, this doesn't alter the fact that the land and the soil as assessed is not considered best and most valuable in terms of the rating criteria that is used for that assessment. So in that respect, it remains not protected by policy RD9. Following on from that, there are also additional recommended conditions. One is from West Sussex, which requests pedestrian crossing improvements outside of the site on the B2128 and Linwick Street junctions. So that would, and the applicant has given their agreement to a condition to that effect. So that would in effect represent a benefit of the development to the surrounding area, as well as improving access to the development itself. I've also recommended additional condition in relation to biodiversity net gain. The application is accompanied by a biodiversity net gain metric assessment, which was submitted within the last few weeks, and which Surrey Wildlife Trust have advised that they consider acceptable. So I've just recommended a condition, as that's considered as a planning benefit of the scheme, to ensure that that would be provided were an application to come forward at reserved matters. I have finally just recommended an additional informative with regards to community infrastructure levy, just to confirm that the scheme would be liable for that. And finally, just to confirm the revised recommendation, which differs from the agenda, there would now be 34 conditions as recommended, and 9 rather than 8 informatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Now we come to our time of public speaking, and there's 4 minutes. I think that Michael Ellis is the first person to speak, and he's sharing his 4 minutes with Paul Norski. So Michael Ellis, please. Thank you.
Right, with her. Can I introduce myself before the buzzer goes? My name is Michael Ellis. I live in Cox Green, in one of the heritage properties impacted by this application. That's who I am. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the area, there are just 47 houses in our hamlet. All are detached and set in linear style, as you have seen. Each property backs onto farmland, and there is no street lighting. Over the years, several attempts have been made for backland development, and all were refused by Waverley or Horsham, which is why Cox Green has retained its rural character. This application to drive a huge backland estate into AGLV farmland has met with unanimous anger. It represents an 80% increase over the current housing numbers, and with the relevant street light pollution, it would totally urbanize the area. 2 years ago, I was part of the team working with Waverley to achieve the appeal refusal. The council has now made a complete U-turn to the arguments put to the inspector and have even gone against the expert advice of Michelle Bolger, their instructed landscape witness. Why have Waverley done this? Perhaps they cannot face another appeal. Far easier to succumb to external pressures and just cave in. I submit this application ignores the inspector's conclusions and the key issues he raised of damage to the landscape. By merely reducing the number of units on the same footprint and implying that with a bit of tinkering with the road layout, landscaping and planting a few trees, the developer hopes everything will be fine. Well, not so. In addition, under the LAA in 2018, the site was offered for development, and I quote extracts from Waverley's rejection. Development would not integrate well with the existing development pattern and would change the character of the area. There would likely be significant impact on the landscape. The wording is crystal clear, so why have Waverley inexplicably reversed their decision? As you're aware, strong objections have been made by Ewhurst, Rudgwick and Horsham councils, all of whom fully understand the local issues. Waverley planners have totally misread the script and have clearly got this one wrong. On behalf of Cox Green, I urge the committee to refuse this speculative application that would totally destroy our rural community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis.
Can I introduce myself before I start? Yeah, I'm Paul Korniski, is the way to pronounce it, but no problem. I also live in Cox Green, but in the partners in West Sussex. And thank you for hearing me. Good evening, everyone. At the 2019 appeal, the inspector stated, quote, the development will not be in an appropriate location having regard to the development plan and LPP1 policy SP2 in particular. At the time, he established a housing supply of 3.9 years and applied the tilted balance. Application of the tilted balance now is not a new higher barrier to overcome. The inspector applied that same high threshold. The dismissed appeal was judged to have adverse impacts significantly and demonstrably outweighing the benefit of 57 new homes. In a forlorn attempt to match Cox Green's settlement pattern and density, the current scheme has 37 homes, a benefit reduction of 35%. Yet there is no evidence whatsoever of anything like that scale of reduction in the harm to landscape, heritage assets, or the detrimental impact on the character of the area. Michelle Bolger, the landscape expert instructor by Waverley, reported, the current application has generally failed to address the issues raised by the inspector. It would result in a similar erosion of the designated area to that caused by the dismissed application and a similar loss of fields that contribute positively to a wider pastoral and green landscape. The inspector was not concerned about the density of the development, but about its location and its failure to maintain the area's prevailing character and setting. The realignment of the access road has exacerbated the associated harm, whilst Horsham Planning agreed that the application, quote, has not overcome the inspector's reasons for dismissal, adding that it represents unsustainable development with no overriding need. So the adverse impacts remain virtually unaltered, whilst the benefits have significantly shrunk due to 35% fewer homes. Refusal now is the only rational outcome, entirely consistent with that at the 2019 appeal, both decisions being made under the NPPF tilted balance. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you indeed. And now I ask Harry Grocott, who's going to speak.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Hello.
you.
Like the other two gentlemen, if I just introduce myself, Harry Grocott, Managing Director at MH Architects. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. The application before you represents a significant enhancement on all fronts from the previous much larger scheme that was refused by the council and dismissed at appeal. The inspector provided clear guidance that the critical issue for consideration was the potential impact on the landscape character generated by the number of units proposed and the unacceptable form and density of the resultant layout. Secondary to this, but as a direct result of the main issue, was the relationship with the listed church and other heritage assets, albeit that when taken in isolation, this element would not have resulted in a dismissal. Therefore, it is fair to say that the principal driver of this revised scheme has been the respect of the landscape context, how to enhance it, and how to deliver an exceptional development within it. MH architects were afforded significant design latitude to make this a reality, and the scheme before you will, we believe, achieve this goal. Fundamental to this approach is the reduction in the number of homes proposed and the immediate benefit to the landscape that this generates in terms of form and density. This application proposes a total of 37 dwellings, some 20 dwellings fewer than the previous application. The resultant reduced density better reflects the immediate context, whilst allowing for the development to capture opportunities within the landscape that will provide wider amenity benefits to the whole village. The existing landscape is defined with field edges comprising hedging and mature trees and is to be significantly reinforced with new planting to offer a robust landscape buffer within the eastern part of the site. This generates a significant enhancement of habitat and net biodiversity gain as a direct result. The retained historic field pattern encapsulates the development parcels and establishes an immediate synergy within the historic landscape setting. Within this framework, the relaxation of density yields a more spacious layout and a pattern of development which is more in keeping with Rudgwick. A combination of passive rear gardens and active frontages are utilised to manage built relationships within the development site, but also to key neighbouring properties. To the southern edge of the site, the density is paired further back. Here, the dwellings front onto an enhanced open area of space, which sits immediately adjacent to the listed church in its setting. It is envisaged that proposed dwellings will be traditional in form and will capture local vernacular detail whilst utilising high quality materials. We've been able to create a layout which avoids built form encroaching into the eastern field, resulting in a negligible impact on the existing public right-of-way to the east. A new bridleway is proposed connecting Church Street to the existing footpath network with links to the village centre. Public open space incorporating leap and lap requirements have been carefully placed within the site, providing enhanced play facilities for the whole village to enjoy. Swales have been sensitively used to soften road edges, creating a more organic, natural entrance to the development, whilst mitigating the necessary technical requirements of managing surface water runoff. This has also provided greater landscape potential, shrouding the access road within the development from wider views and providing it with a green and attractive backdrop. The roads themselves demonstrate a principle of hierarchy, with the primary access road, which has been approved by Horston District Council, rapidly downgrading to shared surfaces and private drives. This generates a softer, more organic layout, wholly in keeping with the semi-rural nature of Rudgwick. A new pedestrian crossing is proposed on the B2128 as part of a wider scheme to enhance pedestrian safety within the village, a welcome byproduct of this development. The scheme also provides a higher affordable housing percentage than required by policy at a time where there remains a significant number of people on the council's housing register and where viability arguments are often used by others to reduce or avoid affordable housing altogether. This scheme will provide homes for 13 families on that waiting list within itself, which in itself should be a key consideration of this application. In summary, the scheme addresses the points raised by the inspector. It not only retains, but reinforces the landscape setting. It offers an enhanced relationship with the village, including its listed assets, and provides 37 new homes that can be built and occupied quickly at a time when housing delivery is constrained. We therefore respectfully ask the committee to approve this application. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I call Councillor Nigel Close, who speaks on behalf of Ewhurst Parish Council.
If I could kindly just introduce myself as well as you just did. I'm here today to speak in my capacity as both the Vice Chairman of Ewhurst and Ellens Green Parish Council, in whose parish this site is, and more pertinently as Chairman of our recently completed neighbourhood plan. Thank you. From the outset, let me confirm that we as the Parish Council strongly object to this revised application for 37 dwellings at Windacres Farm, on several grounds, not least of which is that as the direct representative and voice of the parishioners, we note that to date 120 objections have been registered from the local community, a level of dissension which should be duly noted by the committee. Also, as stated in our formal Parish Council response last September, We contend that the revisions do not address the fundamental objections raised by the inspector when dismissing the appeal on the original application for the site. And we agree with the inspector's conclusion that the adverse impacts of the development would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits when assessed against the policies in the MPPF taken as a whole. The presumption in favour of sustainable development would not therefore apply in this case. Our view has not changed with the new application. Further to Waverley's own up-to-date figures, the number of dwellings given permission within the parish has now risen to more than 150 against our allocation of just 100 in the local plan. And that crucially, most are now either finished or substantially built. Our neighbourhood plan has recently been completed, having been through Regulation 16, and has received the independent examiner's report and approval. His conclusions are particularly relevant in this case. The applicant raised an objection at Regulation 16 that it was wrong for our neighbourhood plan not to allocate sites for housing. The examiner specifically dismissed this objection and referred to the site in particular when stating, "I do not support the Regulation 16 objection to the fact that the plan does not make housing allocations, particularly in respect of the land at Windacres Farm. It has been decided to promote a neighbourhood plan which does not make housing allocations. That is entirely appropriate, not least because the housing expectations set out in the adopted local plan are not just being met, but are likely to be exceeded by a significant extent." Even if one agreed with the applicant's objection, the neighbourhood plan originally sought to allocate housing and carried out an extensive independently assessed housing land availability assessment, which comprehensively rejected Windacres in any event. The consultants, Shrimplin Brown Planning, stated, "Development would have a negative impact on the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside. Development would not be well related to the settlement boundary. It is not considered to be suitable." A further assessment was then carried out by James Garside Planning to ensure all sites have been fairly assessed, and their conclusions on Windacres were as follows. Developments of this scale form a significant encroachment into the AGLV. The site also relates poorly to the settlement of Rudgwick, as the surrounding area is low-density ribbon development forming the approach to the village, with the majority of services and facilities appearing to be much further to the south. The neighbourhood plan examiner continued. The plan has sought to protect the character of the settlements and to ensure that development that does take place meets local housing needs. I believe the document and its policies will form a sound basis for determining planning applications in the parish into the future, and confirm that if successful referendum, the plan be made. In conclusion, therefore, given that the neighbourhood plan has been recommended by the examiner and is going to referendum on June the 30th, it already carries significant weight. If the long and arduous neighbourhood plan process through which we have been subjected to for so many years is to have any credibility, the committee cannot ignore the independent examiner, the parish council, the local parishioners and the inspector, and must turn down this inappropriate proposed development. The council's own decision statement on our neighbourhood plan, issued just over a week ago, agreed and accepted the examiner's recommendations, the main one of which is that we do not need to allocate any further housing within the parish. Can Waverley Council really ignore its own conclusions so soon after agreeing with this, and thereby make a complete mockery of both the planning and neighbourhood plan processes within the borough? I sincerely hope not, as we have gone through too much pain for this whole exercise to have been pointless. I urge you to demonstrate your support for the neighbourhood plan process and the community and refuse this application. Thank you.
Oh. Well done. 4 minutes on the dot. Thank you.
I'm speaking to my dog.
So, councillors, it's your turn to speak, having done so much listening. Councillor Follows.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to members of the public for their very well articulated cases. I'm not often in this chamber as a planning councillor anymore because I'm as leader of the council, and looking at these sorts of issues with tilted balance being applied, naturally I'm going to get quite jumpy straight away. But the appeal decision is quite interesting. So really, if I can try and articulate this question to you, Kate, particularly, it is clear from the appeal decision, certainly paragraphs 74 through 80 on page 18, as well as I think it's paragraph 53, which even deals with Dunsfold, that the tilted balance was pretty properly applied as part of the planning balance, and this was still dismissed. Obviously, there has been a reduction in dwellings. Obviously, I'll hear the opinion of other colleagues, but from my point of view thus far, the harm doesn't seem to have demonstrably decreased, even though the number of dwellings has. I also feel like I need to just check the comment made by the architect, which to me seemed to conflate affordable and social housing as the same thing, which they absolutely are not. But in your view, and I appreciate this is going to be a bit of a qualitative answer, has that harm decreased sufficiently that the tilted balance still applies in your view? I mean, that to me is obviously your assertion through the report, but as the inspectorate has considered the tilted balance and still thrown this out, has the harm genuinely decreased enough to really make that the case?
Yes, okay, sorry, Chair, thank you. Thank you, Councillor Follows. Yes, it's correct. The inspector for the previous appeal did apply a tilted balance. And it's correct that we're now also applying a tilted balance. The application does differ from the previous application. As you've said, the number of units is reduced. There's also additional landscape mitigation proposed now. Other matters like biodiversity net gain and a slight over provision beyond the policy requirement in terms of the proportion of affordable housing. We've considered it quite carefully and discussed it at length as a team of officers. The test that needs to be applied is that the permission should be granted unless the harms significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. As you are all aware, we've been getting a very clear and strong message from the planning inspectorate that we should be giving substantial weight to the provision of housing. So within the context of all of that, my recommendation is that permission should be granted because the harm isn't such and to such an extent that I consider it to significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. That's a matter of judgment, but that's my opinion.
Madam Chair, may I ask a supplementary question directly to the head of planning?
Yes, certainly.
If I may, Zach, do you, in your view, do you believe that the planning inspectorate, either through an instruction from the Secretary of State or merely demonstrated by its decisions, has materially increased in its severity of its decisions from when this was issued in 2019?
I think what I'd say is not based on specific evidence that I can point to in numerate numbers, but in terms of the appeal decisions I'm seeing, not just in Waverley, but across the southeast, particularly on through sort of posts on LinkedIn, etc. I do see a lot of applications where the tilted balance is applied that are being allowed, even where significant harm is being identified. I mean, one classic one recently was the Scotland Lane appeal at Hazelmere. If you read that and you read the section on the landscape harm, for those who may not have seen it, if you read the section on the landscape harm, it's sort of saying, yes, there's significant harm, X, Y, and Z. And you sort of read it and think, well, obviously, clearly they're going to refuse. But then it comes to the point about, the council's not able to demonstrate a 5-year land supply, and on balance, the harm is not so significant and demonstrable to outweigh the benefits when assessed against the framework as a whole. My perception, and that's all it can be, is that that there's a high bar for this significant, well, I mean, the wording itself is significant and demonstrable. I appreciate there's an element of judgment in there. We discussed it as a whole. I think the recommendation even says on balance, but officer's recommendation is that doesn't tie you as the decision maker to any particular decision. And obviously I would point out the previous appeal decision clearly is a material consideration, but we've considered that in our weighing up and have come to the conclusion that we should recommend approval. I hope that answers the question, Jen.
Thank you, Zach. Councillor Henry.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm pleased that application has come to committee, and I am familiar with the territory, which is useful. And I'm happy to contribute to the collection of thoughts that I hope that we shall put together over the next few minutes or so. The fact, and I do find this very worrying and very uncomfortable, is that we don't have a 5-year land supply. Having said that, since the appeal decision, throughout the whole of the Waverley, there has been positive contributions to the housing. I think we should be taking note of that. I would ask you to really listen and pay attention to what the local people have said. As you can see, they've come out in force tonight. This obviously means something very special to them. So I do hope that we are listening to them at least. There is a high bar to consider. Yes, the heritage items, the landscape. We're talking about Cox Green here. We are not talking about Rudgwick, and I think that there is a misunderstanding of exactly where Cox Green is. Cox Green is a hamlet. It doesn't have any facilities at all. There is nothing there. There's not a pub. There's not even a toilet. So I want you to take that on board. Climate control, that's very much at the top of our agenda. And I hate to think that we're sort of trashing the landscape and heritage. And in an age where we're living with a war on our doorstep, where the breadbasket of Ukraine is not going to be providing that extra 25% that the whole world needs, we should take these things quite seriously. Here we're looking at useful agricultural land. It's not brownfield land. The reduction in the number of houses since the 2 applications have come on, I think that's not relevant whatsoever. What I am really worried about is the uplift to the number of houses in Ellen's Green, in Cox Green. An uplift of 80%, that's huge. That's huge. And what they're proposing is so different to what there is in Ellen's Green. Here in Ellen's Green, Cox Green. It's a linear landscape. You don't have houses on the back of one another. And what is being recommended, although this will come for reserved matters, 2.5-story houses, this will look totally alien in the landscape, and how unpleasant for the existing amenity of the local people. Sustainability. People will be dependent on cars because to walk 2 kilometres to the local shop, it's not very doable. I think I'll park it there. I do think this is inappropriate development, and I'll be quite interested to hear what other people have to say. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Henry, and Councillor Denis.
Thank you. We seem to have strayed away from the question section. So this isn't what I'm going to say. So if you can, I had some questions to ask, which is why I got my hand up at the start. So if we could stop the clock, this is not the speech.
No, I mean,
we normally have a section where we ask questions before going into
Councillor Denis, I think we'll just have general debate.
Okay, but they've asked some. I'd like to come back at the ending because I think there's some questions from what was presented. Okay.
Okay, so you're waiting. So Councillor Goodridge is next, and then followed by Councillor Cossa. So Councillor Goodridge.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Here we have an application for 37 houses. Previously it was 57. And of course, it's the usual tactics. You put in an application for an outrageous large number, and then when you come back with 20 less, it's assumed that it would be all right. And of course, in this case, we have a tilted balance decision to make. And before we had a tilted balance decision to make, it would seem that our housing supply, even on everybody on the figures, are we have more now than we did back in 2019, or nearer 5 than we did in 2019. And I don't know whether that the bar then goes down a bit or up, or depending how far off you are, how big the bar goes up. But the fact of the matter is, using the tilted balance, presumably we now have less affordable housing being provided as we have less houses being built, which comes off part of the benefit, I would suggest. When you look at the reasons on the reasons for refusing side, we had the long list, which is shown on page, I can't remember the page number now, it doesn't matter. But when you get, for example, one of the benefits is now we have additional landscaping, for example, you then hear that the officers are quite rightly reporting that despite that, it is still a development that is unacceptable. We have problems with the spatial part. We have the problems with the landscape. We have, and the officer's report makes it very clear that the reduction in the number of housing does not affect the landscape, intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside. We've still got 37 houses there. And the fact that the additional landscaping is being provided doesn't actually overcome that problem. And therefore, you know, when I'm trying to apply the tilted balance, when you take something off one part of the scale and you take off something on the other side of the scale, we end up roughly with the scales as they were before. And I take the view, at the moment I take the view, but I'm very keen to hear what my colleagues say. I do feel on the tilted balance at the moment that the views expressed by the inspector still apply. It says on balance, this is the officer's report on page 17, it says on balance, notwithstanding the reduction, that's in number of units, it is not considered that a development of 37 units would constitute modest development. So we still have not got modest development despite the reduction to 20 units and so on. So, and the landscape specialist has confirmed the landscape harm still remains despite provision, proposed provision of this buffer. So, you know, one looks at it and I have to say that I don't think the reduction in 20 units, in my view, alters the tilted balance to the one that the inspector came to a conclusion about 2 or 3 years ago.
Thank you,
so
Councillor.
at the moment, I'm minded to not go with the officer's recommendation.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Goodridge. I think, Zach, you want to speak. Kevin, your microphone's on, but Zach, first you want to say something.
Yeah, just very quickly. Yeah, I mean, obviously hear what Councillor Goodridge says, and the point I'd make is that there is an element of judgment that would need to be applied to this by you as the decision maker, and it's only right that you're debating this properly and that you assess, you know, the tilted balance and what weight you feel. The real test will come down to that paragraph 11D of the NPPF as to whether or not you feel that the harm significantly and demonstrably outweighs the benefits when taking it to the framework as a whole. So yeah, absolutely, you know, I wouldn't want to sort of disagree on what you're saying there. That's for you as to make the judgment. The 2 points very quickly, and I think I heard one of the councillors say it's a binary thing, and they're absolutely right. It's you either have a 5-year land supply or you don't. Much as I'd love to get up to sort of 4.9 and say, well, you know, it's only 0.1, the application is a binary one, and that's absolutely correct, unfortunately. We are working, as per the all council briefing, we're working towards trying to get back to a position where we can demonstrate 5 years land supply, but at the moment we are where we are. The only other point I'd make is in the officer's report, we're not saying that the additional landscaping in itself is a benefit. What we're saying is that it slightly reduces the landscape harm. And although, yeah, our landscape advisor has still identified harm, and indeed we still identified harm as officers, that has taken it to the point where, in our opinion, the tilted balance in terms of approving the scheme does outweigh is not outweighed by the significant and demonstrable harm. But again, it's not my decision. Thankfully, it's your decision as the elected members and the decision maker.
Thank you, Zach. I'll just run through the order of speakers so that you're all comfortable with knowing that I've seen you. I will go to Councillor Dinas next, and then Councillor Wilson, Councillor Cossa, Councillor Reid, and Councillor Darcy. So, Councillor Dinas, you're next.
Thank you. This is countryside beyond the green belt. It's outside any defined settlement and it's situated in AGLV. Page 5 recognised it would result in some harm to the council's spatial strategy, heritage assets and landscape and intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside. Policy RE1, intrinsic beauty of the countryside, should be recognised and safeguarded in accordance with the MPPF. The site is located within AGLV, policy RG3, new development must respect and where appropriate, enhance the character of the landscape in which it's located, commensurate with its designation. The AGLV will be retained for its own sake as a buffer to the ANOB. This site falls within Limb 5 of the spatial strategy, which allows only modest development to meet local needs. The appeal inspector said 57 houses were not considered modest growth, and it was not an appropriate location, which is contrary to policy SP2, and that's confirmed on page 17. Although we've reduced to 37, which is hardly modest against a hamlet of 47, the location is the same and therefore cannot be an appropriate location. Policy TD1 must be related into size, scale and character to its surroundings, and retained policies D1 and D4 are attributable, substantial and full weight. I mean, the area sits within the wooded low weald, described as a tranquil landscape with a sense of remoteness and intimacy due to the wooded tree area. Page 20, the inspector concluded that the local landscape designation would be eroded and a loss of field that contribute positively to a wider pastoral and green landscape. The approach to and from the settlement along the public right-of-way would become more urbanised and reduce the overall rural setting. Continuing, he said, however, it would be at odds with the context of linear and dispersed pattern of housing. Now, the applicant has submitted a new landscape plan that says it will reduce the harm. And I think the case officer states that the proposal still fails to comply with policies TD1, RE1, RE3, D1, D4, and fails to meet paragraphs 124, 130 and 174 of the MPPF. The report doesn't go into detail about its own landscape evidence submitted on the 15th of March by Michelle Bolger. It talks about the revised plans and it says, and I'm quoting from their document, it would not be sufficient to mitigate harm to the landscape identified in BN01. The conclusions read, and I will read them out because I think it's important. Even with the new landscape strategy, the development would result in a loss of area of valued landscape, an erosion in the qualities of the immediately surrounding valued landscape, harm to the rural setting of Rudgwick and Cox Green, a development that would be unsympathetic to the area's prevailing character, harm to the visual amenity to the users of the public right-of-way, although this would lessen in time where the views to the east were concerned, and says conflicts with a landscape strategy or guidance for the area. So this is Waverley's expert evidence submitted on the 15th of March, and it's been ignored. There are other issues that have been raised tonight. Heritage assets, the impact on the Rudgwick Conservation Area, which we haven't even got into yet, which should be preserved and enhanced to ensure continued protection and enjoyment of the historic environment and that's contrary to policies HE3 and HE5, which are afforded significant weight. Page 31, paragraph 3, the inspector said there would be conflict with HE3 and HEH. We seek to safeguard the significance of heritage assets, protect the setting of listed buildings and protect open spaces and views to the conservation and setting of a conservation area. I think the question to Councillor Follows, which he put, the bar was set high, Councillor Follows, when it went to appeal. The MPPF has not changed at all since that date. So it has not changed the actual guidance. I mean, it's been raised about the 5-year housing supply and the tilted balance. I mean, this is correct. When we went to the appeal, as it was said, I think we had 3.9. The tilted balance was applied, and the whole way through that report, he makes reference to that tilted balance. So the inspector recognised that 57 houses would be a benefit, but as been raised by my colleagues, that's reduced to 37, so the benefit has been reduced. Now he concluded, and that's point 87 of the appeal document that you've been put on your desk. So he concluded, therefore, the adverse impacts of the development would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits when assessed against the policies in the MPPF taken as a whole. The presumption in favour of sustainable development would not apply. The proposal would be contrary to the development plan with no material considerations to indicate that planning permission should be granted. Thank you, Chair. I look forward to any additional comments from my colleagues.
Thank you, Councillor Dinas. Councillor Wilson, you're next.
Thank you, Chair. Just running through what I've seen and heard, the housing supply is always going to be a problem for us, but it's a problem that we've got to grasp and try and do something about. Now, a bean crop is not normally planted on agricultural land, except to fortify the soil, was my understanding. And I do think agriculture is going to become very important as we lack supplies from abroad. And I asked myself, has the size of the house in development decreased? I mean, it doesn't matter how many houses you put on it. If you put a large development somewhere, it still looks the same. So taking that amount of houses out is of no visual benefit to my mind. I'm a supporter of affordable housing, but I can't see how anybody could afford to travel from there to any of the centres of work. It's a beautiful location. I passed there many times. In fact, I used to go to the Steam Fair every year when it was up there. I gather too that Rodgwick and Horsham have actually got on top of their housing supply. So they are saying that they don't need any more housing, certainly there where the benefits are not going to them. So all in all, I think we're looking at something that gives us less actual benefits, as Councillor Dinas said, less affordable housing and a visual eyesore. And I really cannot support that, regardless of any of the other matters that my colleagues are going to raise. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Cotter and then Councillor Reid. So Councillor Cotter.
Thank you very much. I just want to go back to sort of basics for one moment and look at our role as a planning committee, because I think this is a pretty significant application for us to look at, actually. It isn't the case, as sometimes is presumed by others, that we have a free hand in just looking at every application that comes in front of us and deciding, do we like it or don't we like it, and what are we going to do about it? We're obliged to work within a national planning framework. I actually have no problem with that. I think it's entirely appropriate that the national government should set some standards and set some context and provision about the amount and type of housing supply needed across the country. Our job is to set our own local plan and make sure that we have something that within that national context provides, if you like, for our share and provides some local characteristics that we are allowed to do. So that when applications individually then come in front of us, our job, as all members of the committee know, is to actually look at the application within those frameworks and decide. We're often deciding and making judgments about whether they do meet the place standards we've set and the places we think housing should be delivered, and all sorts of other design and criteria and so on. Now, the presumption at the moment in the national planning framework is for sustainable development. We are told, and I'm prepared to accept, there is a need for additional housing, and there's a particular need for more affordable housing, and we work within that context. Now, if we judged the application that we have in front of us today within that context and framework, my instinct is, and certainly my own judgment, I can't talk on behalf of other members of the committee, is that we may well have felt that the harm outweighed and we will possibly have been looking towards refusing the application. However, we are not in that position as we sit here today. It is the case, and it's not something for us to sit and debate and argue about how we got there today. But the fact is, we don't have, as we're required to, a 5-year housing supply. And therefore, the tilted balance, as has been mentioned, does kick in. And the words of that are quite significant. What they talk about is the need to ensure that the harms significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. Now, I've read, as I'm sure other colleagues here have read, a whole number of recent appeals where appeals have been granted where the application has been turned down because the tilted balance has been engaged. And that bar, as I say, is a very, very high one. I respect the views of all my colleagues, and I understand why some of them may reach a different judgment in that. I can only say that seeking to take that context into account, and it's that I particularly wanted to stress this evening, I have read in carefully, and I've also listened carefully to what I've heard. I don't think if I lived where some of the representatives who've been here tonight lived, I would think any differently to them. But we do have a wider responsibility. I have read the report from our officers, and I think my view is that on balance, they've done a really excellent assessment on this with a heavy heart. And it is with a heavy heart, because I don't want to be in this position any more than any other member of this committee. I feel that the thing I need to do tonight is to support the recommendation of our officers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Cossa. Now, Councillor Reid, and then followed by Councillor Darcy. Councillor Reid.
Thank you, Chair. I must declare that I have been a parish councillor for Ewhurst with Ellens Green. I know the area very well. I live very near the border with West Sussex, 6 miles in fact. And this development, I know exactly the fields. I too have been to steam fairs there. It's quite a high area of land with several fields. It is not, I'm not an expert on agriculture, but I don't think it's of great agricultural value. It's been used, as I say, for the steam fair for years, ever since I've remembered it. Now, my concerns are, because I'm a member of the AONB, and we're going through nationally and locally looking at the boundaries, and we are very, very near here with the AONB to the area of great landscape value. And eventually, and I'm assuming this will happen, that will be encompassed by the area of great, the great area of great landscape value will be encompassed and included in the ONB. So that I think I have to consider. There is also the heritage aspect. I know the church extremely well. I know the Preservation Society has done an awful lot of work. I know that the parish is really, really attentive to the whole of the community there. I'm also a very keen walker, and I know the footpaths and the extension of the Downs Link. I also know that an awful lot of work over the years, I've lived in Surrey for 20 years, over the years has been put into neighbourhood plans. And both in Ellens Green and Ewhurst. And I assume an awful lot of work's gone into this local plan. And I don't want it to be not considered by everyone. I do not agree. I think really that the views of the inspector still apply, just like Councillor Goodrich. And I think that's more or less what I've got to say. I think that one lot of approval could lead to more expansion on that site. I was brought up in a village. I like village life. And I think that too many houses destroy a certain amount of that cohesion. And my last point is the facilities. This is a long, long way. You know, Ewhurst had, you know, at the turn of the century had, you know, very many shops. I think it was sort of nearly 20 shops. Now, I think it's got a hairdresser's and a village shop. And then you're going further away now from Ewhurst and you come to Cox Green. I don't think there's anything there. And the same with Ellens Green, you know, it's just beautiful countryside. So I will leave it there, you know, for people to decide.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Darcy, just before you speak, Zach, you want to say something?
Only very briefly. I mean, Councillor Reid has spoken very eloquently and obviously respect her views. I just want to make 2 or 3 very quick points. We have to judge the application on the allocations as are today. At the moment, it's not in the AONB. So I don't doubt that one day it might be, but it's speculation and we don't have any guarantees that it's AONB, so you can't treat it as AONB. The neighbourhood plan point is absolutely right. The neighbourhood plan has been, it hasn't been made, so it doesn't form yet part of the development plan, but it is a material consideration because it's got a statement that it can now go out to referendum. So yes, you will want to weigh that into the balance. And then I think the third point you made was about what might happen in the future with the neighbouring land. And I think we just have to, you know, whilst I accept your right to have a view about that and to have concerns about that, we have to deal with the application before us. That would obviously be subject to its own planning application. Were that to occur, we don't know if it will or won't, Chairman. Those are the only points I was going to make. And I think Kate's just got one point about this proximity to services.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just to make a point in relation to proximity to services, the inspector for the previous appeal, whilst he concluded that there was harm against our spatial strategy policy SP2, he also concluded in effect that there was no significant issue with lack of facilities within walking distance. That's in paragraphs 38 and 39 of the appeal decision. So he concluded that it would not be overly dependent on private cars as a mode of transport, and that most services and facilities would be within an acceptable walking distance. So just to state those previous conclusions from the inspector, just for information. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. So just a running order of the next speakers, it's Councillor Darcy, Councillor Baker, Councillor Follows and Councillor Gale. Councillor Darcy, please.
I think the laughter of the residents tells the story there. What I was going to ask about, or first of all, what I was going to say was, I'd like to deal with the tilted balance, which I don't really like that phrase. I think it's skewed balance is a better phrase. There's 2 things. The first thing I would note is that the inspector in his upholding of the refusal, based his decision on having a 3.9-year housing supply. So in other words, he applied the so-called tilted balance when he made his decision to uphold the refusal. So what we seem to be being told is that the tilted balance has tilted further since the appeal. Although no such guidance has been issued, so this is conjecture and also doesn't make any sense, because if you think about it, the balance is tilted or it isn't tilted. So the test remains, as far as I can see, the same as it was in 2019. Does the harm significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits? Now, unlike my colleague, Councillor Cossa, I conclude that the inspector said it did, because he refused the appeal. Therefore, the inspector, the planning inspector, thought that the harm significantly and demonstrably outweighed the benefits. We asked a landscape consultant to review that, to see that if the changes that had been made had made a significant difference. And they also found that the harm significantly and demonstrably outweighed the benefits. So we've got two experts telling us this. Now, I'm not inclined to put my opinion above those of those experts. I'm inclined to go along with what they say. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. The next thing I'd like to ask about is biodiversity net gain. Now, I was interested in this because I looked through all the documents on the portal about ecology, and I was unable, I didn't find one that included a biodiversity net gain metric. So it may be that I just missed it, but was it on the portal?
Yes, thank you, Councillor Dossey. Firstly, to come back on the point regarding the biodiversity net gain, yes, there's a report on that matter, which is on the portal, yes. It wasn't with us at submission, but it has, we've subsequently received it and it was uploaded straight away to the portal. With regards to the matter of, I know you stated that the landscape witness has said that the harms would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. If I could just correct you on a point of terminology, the landscape witness has identified that there's a landscape harm and has stated that whilst that is reduced by the additional landscaping buffer which they've proposed during the course of consideration of the application, the harm overall, it still remains that there is a degree of harm. But just to clarify that a landscape specialist providing us with comments and indeed a landscape witness working within an appeal wouldn't be drawing conclusions with regards to the planning balance, just with regards to the harm. But you're correct that she does identify that there continues to be a level of harm which officers agree with. Thank you.
Well, I'd just like to read out what the expert said. I consider that the policy conflicts identified by the inspector remain the same. That seems fairly clear to me.
That's with regards to the landscape harm that isn't performing a planning balance, which is entirely outside of the role of a landscape specialist, and which I've not seen any indication within either of the written statements from our landscape specialist that indicate they performed a planning balance.
Well, okay, I wasn't suggesting they had. What I'm suggesting was that they had identified that the same harms that the inspector identified were still there. So unless, as I said, there has been a change in the official guidance, then I don't see how you can say, I just don't get it. To me, it makes no sense what you're suggesting. So as far as I'm concerned, my opinion is that I'm going to follow what the inspector said in 2019 because there's nothing significantly changed. That's clear.
Can I just say what I think has changed? The application is reduced from 57 to 37 and there's additional landscaping proposed. And that's why we have looked at it and we believe that it no longer significantly and demonstrably outweighs. That's our recommendation to you, but you are the decision makers in this. And, you know, obviously I'm listening to
Zach,
what was said.
I know that, Jack.
Yeah,
I'm not
but-
stupid. I understood what you said.
Yeah.
Can we have this discussion
through the chair,
please?
Yeah, Chairman, can I just, would I be able to just come back?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, the point that Kate made is absolutely the correct one. And our officers identify ourselves that there is harm to the landscape. We've made that very clear, but on balance, we believe that the tilted balance applies, that harm is not so significant and does not significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits when taken in the framework as a whole. That's our recommendation to you. And it is a different scheme. If the scheme was exactly identical to the one that was put forward and discussed on the previous appeal, I would say, yeah, it would be nonsensical for us to take a different view.
Thank you.
Thank
Zach.
you.
So Darcy.
Could I just say that the expert landscape consultant reviewed the scheme that we're talking about now and said the policy conflicts identified by the inspector remain the same. Okay, so I'm a little bit flabbergasted by that, I have to say. I was initially quite surprised at the decision that the officer had made. Now I'm totally gobsmacked.
Well, through you, Chairman, I don't really understand where Councillor Darcy's come from. The landscape officer has advised, our specialist has advised that there is landscape harm. We as officers are acknowledging there is landscape harm. We are saying that that landscape harm, in our opinion, does not significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits when taken with the framework as a whole. And that's the recommendation. The landscape.
Please, Zach, you've made the same point 15
yes,
times.
but you don't seem to be understanding.
I do understand it.
One minute, Councillor Darcy. Kate, would you like to speak, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. If I could just quote to you and just to give you a bit of clarification as to how the recommendation has arisen from the landscape briefing note, which was provided by Michelle Bolger, our expert landscape consultant, specifically to review the amendments which the applicant has submitted during the course of consideration of the application. At paragraph 12, she discusses those amendments, and I will be clear in saying this, that her conclusions are clear that landscape harm does still remain, and in stating this, I'm not stating that it doesn't, but just to be clear what she said about the difference. She said the new landscaping strategy plan includes a landscape buffer outside the eastern boundary of the site. This is an improvement on the previous master plan, and that's referring to the application as submitted. In itself, it would not be out of character in the local landscape. If it established well, it would eventually limit views of the development from the Sussex border path. However, it would not be sufficient to mitigate the harm to the landscape identified in her original note. So that's just to clarify the difference which our landscaping consultant has acknowledged there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Darcy. Do you have other points?
Do I have other points? Yes. The biodiversity net gain. I thought I heard the officer suggest that because they provided a biodiversity net gain metric, as I understand it, although I didn't hear what the score was on that metric, this counted as a benefit. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes, it's a planning benefit.
So isn't it the fact that the NPPF requires biodiversity net gain?
We'll just look at the exact wording for you, thank you. But it's clear with this application that they're proposing a significant biodiversity net gain.
What does significant mean?
Don't have the exact figures in front of me, but I think it was something around a 96% increase in habitat units.
What does that amount to in terms of biodiversity net gain?
I'm afraid I don't have the exact figure in front of me, Councillor Darcy.
I see one of my fellow councillors is getting fed up with my line of questioning, so I'd better move on. I just like to say that 37 houses, but while a reduction from 57 is still, it would seem to be nearly doubling the size of the village. And therefore, it seems to be, it is a significant development, and therefore, I think we should turn it down because it's inappropriate where it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Darcy. Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Chair. I do actually go to Rudgwick once a week to the village hall to partake in an activity there. So I know what the countryside looks like surrounding, at least I do as of the last couple of weeks when it's been daylight. Now, what concerns me, what makes me really quite uneasy is the fact that we have what is essentially an artificial boundary running through this site, and that potentially, because of, I think, basically the tilted balance in the large community on one side of that boundary, we are, so to speak, inflicting potentially development on the neighbouring settlement. And that worries me. And I know that we have to deal with that, but it still makes me very uneasy. And I would echo what Councillor Darcy has just said, that the expansion of houses in the neighbouring settlement is absolutely enormous. It's a very huge increase. Whereas the 35 houses that we are now considering is very small, I think, in terms of Waverley's overall requirement. So that is something that influences me a great deal in deciding what my vote should be. There are another couple of points I would like to make. The harm to the landscape. I just don't see, quite honestly, however you calculate it and cut it and chop it, that the landscape is not harmed by putting bricks and mortar in. And goodness, I do know that we need houses, and I know that we need affordable houses. I chaired a parish council housing working party for 10 years. But it's a question of what we give up. And I'm also very keen on paying attention to neighbourhood plans, because parish council covering my ward, Milford, and that's Whitley Parish Council, made their neighbourhood plan a year ago, and they should be regarded. They do represent the sensible wishes of local communities. So those are the points that influence my thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Baker. Kate, did you have an answer about significant net gain there?
Yes, just to quote the part of the MPPF which refers to biodiversity net gain, and it doesn't make a requirement for biodiversity net gain, although it does support it. So paragraph 180 part D says development whose primary objective is to conserve or enhance biodiversity should be supported, while opportunities to improve biodiversity in and around development should be integrated as part of their design, especially where this can secure measurable net gains for biodiversity or enhance public access to nature where this is appropriate. So it's not placing an absolute requirement, but saying that biodiversity net gain overall is supported. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the last two speakers are Councillor Follows and Councillor Gale. Councillor Follows.
Thank you, Chair. Asked some questions at the beginning. Now, having heard everybody, I'll try and give a view. This is one of those ones where I'm probably going to get accused of bringing politics into planning by at least somebody in this room, but it's applications like this that show to me what a false pretense that is, and that we need to shed some of that naivety. An example, Councillor Henry at the beginning talked about building on agricultural land. I cannot stress how much I agree with you that we should not be building on that sort of land, and I can see why residents and members would bring it up, because multiple statements have been made by the Secretary of State responsible for planning saying that we shouldn't be doing it. But of course, he hasn't ended up in the NPPF, despite him saying that. And the same is the case of Biodiversity Net Gain. Lots of statements in the press and the public about that because it's in the Environment Act. When will we actually see that translated into secondary legislation that allow us in a planning committee to use that as a reason to chuck it out? Who knows? Probably some years. So, as you probably all know by now, it's my pretty firm opinion that national planning policy pretty much shows a contempt for neighbourhood plans and localism, whilst having the pretense of supporting them. It certainly gives us no powers to force developers to build, and that's why we have this 5-year housing land supply matter in the first place. So, Councillor Darcy, thank you very much for articulating a point I'm trying to wrangle with, because I'm sitting here weighing up something I know is not a material planning matter that we're all having to think about. And that's that the Planning Inspectorate have clearly got more harsh in their assessments. And I want to thank the head of planning for his honesty at the beginning of admitting that that clearly is the case. And we've seen it in appeal decisions too. It should be, as Councillor Dinas has stated and others have said here, it should be the same Planning Inspectorate looking at the same information, weighing up the same evidence, applying as they have done previously, the same tilted balance. But we know that's not the case, but we can't apply that to our thinking here because it's not a matter of planning policy, it's a matter of politics. So going back to the planning balance, has the harm decreased with the reduction of housing? Marginally. Has the benefit decreased? Well, I concur with members who have expressed the extremely logical view that it surely must have decreased proportionally as well. So I do believe we should refuse this. And I imagine, and apologies, my Wi-Fi has been playing up a little bit, so I haven't been able to get the wording, that the previous refusal from the last application, probably taken lock stock, is probably appropriate, especially then as when this is inevitably appealed, not only will the same planning inspectorate be looking at the same information, they'll be basing it on the same refusal reasons as well. So I'm very happy to propose a refusal on the grounds of the previous refusal statement, following, of course, confirmation of what that is from officers, which I'll ask for in a moment. But I can't do anything other than say at the end, though, I bet you anything you like the planning inspectorate come to a different conclusion now in 2022 than they did in 2019 based on the same information on the same refusal statements. I'm very happy to be proved wrong, but I suspect that's where you'll see that we need to stop shedding, we need to shed some of this naivety about pretending that planning isn't political whatsoever. So I will motion, Chair, following Councillor Gale's speech, and assuming that the planning refusal reasons are compatible, the same reasons as refusal as before. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Follows. We have an additional speaker after Councillor Gale. We have Kevin Dinas again. So Councillor Gale, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've listened with interest tonight because it's quite an interesting application that we're seeing here. I actually feel sorry for Waverley Borough Council at the moment because we're trying to achieve a 5-year housing supply in an area that is awash with AGLV, Greenbelt, AONB, SSIs, agricultural land. From my own personal experience as a Whitley Parish Councillor, when we tried to do our neighbourhood plan, we had to give up trying to allocate housing sites. We didn't have anywhere. And what's happened in our parish is some areas have been taken out of the Greenbelt to actually give us the numbers that we've been told we need to have in that village. So we're seeing overdevelopment in small villages. This is what we're seeing. And it is purely because somebody somewhere decided we should build this many houses. And they didn't look at the areas they were delegating it to. Now, apparently it's not relevant in the tilted balance, whether we've got more or less now, it's still the tilted balance and we're still under 5 years. And this is something that maybe we'll never achieve, I don't know. However, this site, it is still where a developer is trying to build in what was determined an inappropriate site. That's what the last appeal said. And this increase, although less, is still an 80% increase in the housing in Cox Green. It is going to have harm to a hamlet, in my opinion. its current status is hamlet. They said themselves, they live in a beautiful area. There is no street lighting. It's quiet. It's rural. They don't have shops. They don't have garages. They don't have things like that. So I can't see how we can actually say this time it's different. They are still trying to build in an area which was determined inappropriate by an inspector. Now, if he wants to go back on what he said last time, well, we'll have to listen to him, won't we? Because he is determining what we're all having to live with here. And we should be looking after our residents because they are the people that have to put up with this. But I do feel sorry for our planners because they go by the law and that's what they're here for. So when they give us the law and the regulations and the RDs, whatever they are, and the LPs, whatever they are, that's because it's in law. But we want to make a statement. I think we should. We don't necessarily have to go along with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gale. You probably won't be surprised, everyone. There's another speaker after Councillor Denis, Councillor Goodridge. And Councillor Goodridge, you are lucky number 13 tonight. So, Councillor Denis.
Thank you. I was just going to summarise some of the questions that were put forward earlier. I think Zach said we can't, the ANOB is irrelevant, yes, but the damage to the AGLV is relevant, and that's been evidenced. We talked about the walking distances, and, 1.7 to 2 kilometres. I'd give a bet to anybody to try pushing a pram from that location, crossing the road where there's no pavements, walking down to the shop or to the village hall. Good luck to you, that's all I will say. I'll just raise a couple of points which haven't been raised in the report. Page 19, it says the affordable units will be geographically clustered in 2 adjacent clusters within the development. Really? Not impressed with that. Page 21, access to the road will still to continue to cross into the eastern field, breaking the tree line. As such, will be continued to have adverse impact on this part of the site. Not good. Page 23, and the wording I think is unfortunate because it says there is one unfortunate relationship whereby a garage serving plot 2 has been shown extending down in an overbearing form. Now it says it could be reduced by the reduction in height of the garage. But how small are you going to have the garage to actually reduce an overbearing building? I mean, a garage is a garage. You've got to be able to stand up in it and drive the car in. I raise those points purely because I think it just shows the overall flaws in this application. You'll be delighted I haven't even mentioned the great crested newts. But Councillor Reid, and I could just read back what Michelle Bolger says, what the inspector, I don't think I need to, I think people realise. So I won't be supporting that. I'm grateful to, it's been an interesting debate, but I don't think I can support this in any way. Thank you for letting me come back.
Thank you, Councillor Denis. Councillor Goodridge.
I just have an unlucky question as number 13 speaker. We've heard the status of the neighbourhood plan, that it's now sort of ready, oven ready to go to the inspector or go to a referendum, rather. I assume that when the appeal in 2019 was held, the neighbourhood plan was less advanced than it is now. And therefore, would that not take a little bit more in the balanced formula that we're now dealing with a neighbourhood plan that is of a greater status than it was 4 years ago?
Thank you very much, Councillor Goodridge. Zach, would you like to respond to that point? The point is that the neighbourhood plan now is further advanced. Yeah.
Yes, once it's been, the statement has been accepted by me as under delegated powers on behalf of the council for it to go out to referendum, then it obtains a greater level of weight than it did prior to that decision being taken. So as it goes through the process, it obtains a certain level of material planning weight. Ultimately, once it's made, i.e. adopted, and that will follow the referendum, then it would get full weight as part of the development plan. So certainly if members were minded to refuse, which I think, on balance, I can see what's coming, then reference could certainly be made to conflict with the what we would say the emerging Ewhurst and Ellens Green neighbourhood plan.
Madam Chair, may I propose a motion then?
Well, we'll take the recommendation, shall we? First of all, if you don't mind if the chair reads the recommendation. And I believe that recommendation B will automatically fall if recommendation A falls. But if I read recommendation A and then we'll take a vote. Recommendation A is that planning permission is granted subject to the conditions and the informatives and a legal agreement to secure provision of affordable housing, sustainable transport measures, bridle improvements, and management and maintenance of SUDs, open space and play space. Councillors, would you like to show whether you are in favour of granting this application? And those against, please. Yep. Oh, are there any abstentions, please? Yep.
Thank you, Chairman. That was 2 for, 11 against and 2 abstentions.
Thank you. Councillor Follows.
Before I propose a refusal set of reasons, could I just ask that the 2018 refusal be read so that we can just, rather than assuming that it's acceptable wording, and whatever that wording is, of course, to append the statement regarding neighbourhood plan status.
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Follows. I certainly can read out our refusal reasons for the 2018 application. However, the inspector's conclusions didn't effectively match up to our refusal reasons, and his reasons for refusing aren't outlined, unfortunately, in the same accessible or numerical manner in that respect. The one thing I would say in relation to refusal reasons here, and I certainly appreciate the sentiment that it would be useful to copy them directly as far as possible, in terms of indicating clearly that the assessments are similar, is that in relation to the previous application, we had a separate refusal reason with regards to heritage harm, but the inspector in his decision drew a fairly clear conclusion that he didn't feel that the heritage harm in itself amounted to a reason for refusal, i.e. that it was outweighed by the public benefits. So if that's a harm which members have concern about, I think it would probably be appropriate to incorporate that with a refusal reason with regards to impact on countryside and character and beauty and landscape as a cumulative harm. So with that in mind, we have, as we've been discussing this, drafted some or a potential refusal reason. I don't know if you want me to first though read out the relevant ones from the 2018 one.
With the chair's consent, I think that would be helpful.
Yes, Zach, you would like to say something first?
Oh, just the only other one, and Kate will read these out. The only other one that I think would certainly drop off was the residential amenity impact on April Rise, Church Street, because obviously the scheme has been amended to address that. But I'll pass over my copy of the original decision to Kate. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Zach. So now if I can find it. No, I can't find it. I'll read from the report. So it's also on page 11 of the report. So the first refusal reason of the 2018 application was the development is unsustainable due to its scale and location and would be contrary to policy SP2 of the local plan. On the basis of the appeal decision, I would possibly recommend to you adding to that, and I don't know whether.
Sorry, is it worth just reading them out? And then,
Oh, okay, yeah, sorry, of course, no, thank you.
Oh, right.
Okay, in that case, should I read out my proposed draft reasons for your comment? So firstly, the proposal would conflict with the council's spatial strategy and represent disproportionate development in countryside beyond the green belt, which would be excessive in scale compared to the modest level of development to meet local needs identified as suitable for this location. The proposal would therefore be contrary to policy SB2 and ALH1 of the local plan.
With the addition also of the neighbourhood plan section.
Yes, I don't know necessarily that I don't know what your thoughts are, Zach and Chris, but I don't know that we could necessarily apply that to this particular refusal reason because it's effectively at a borough level. But
well, I would just say that the neighbourhood plan doesn't itself allocate housing, so I think the reference to neighbourhood plan would be better placed in the character and other part, but it would still be referenced and certainly taken into consideration by the entire.
I'm happy to take officers' recommendations on that, and happy to propose, although I believe as Councillor Dean is almost certainly going to check to second if he might have any other to add.
Yeah. Councillor Dean.
Sorry, there are two others.
Oh, yep. Okay.
Yes, sorry to add with the draft reasons I have here. The second one would be the proposal would be detrimental to the special character and beauty of the area of great landscape value and would harm the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside. The proposal would also be detrimental to the rural character of the locality by reason of the urban backland formation conflicting with the linear character of development in Coxgreen and Ridgewick. The development would also result in less than substantial harm to the significance of the Grade 1 listed Holy Trinity Church and Grade 2 listed Duke's Farmhouse, as well as harm to the character and appearance of the conservation area. The harms would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits of the scheme and would be contrary to policies RE1, RE3 and TD1 of the local plan, retain policies D1, D4, H3, HE3 and HE8 of the local plan 2002, the provisions of the emerging Ewhurst and Ellens Green neighbourhood plan and guidance contained in the MPPF. And then the final recommended refusal reason on the basis of what you've said and the decision to refuse would just be in relation to lack of legal agreement, because obviously one hasn't been signed at this point. So in the absence of a completed legal agreement, the development would fail to make satisfactory provision for affordable housing, the maintenance of play space, the maintenance of SUDs, the maintenance of open space, the provision and monitoring of a travel plan, and the provision of a new public right-of-way. The proposal would therefore be contrary to policies ICS1, AHN1, LRC1 and ST1 of the local plan in paragraph 169 of the MPPF. And thank you, that's everything.
Yep, thank you very much, Kate. Councillor Denis.
Most of what I was going to say, but when we talk about the MPPF, obviously I was going to raise paragraphs 124, 130 and 174. I don't know whether we need to specifically mention those because they've been raised in the appeal. I wonder whether we need to mention the linear style when we talk about the character of the area. My apologies. The overbearing nature of the garage on page 23 that I raised, whether that should be in there. It talks about loss of trees on page 33. And obviously a loss of agricultural land, even though I know you say it's not the most valuable land, it is still agricultural land. So it's the agricultural land. The issue of the garage, which you've said was unfortunate, and the loss of trees, whether we can put those three either within those.
Kate?
Sorry, yes, if I could just advise the committee in relation to those points. Loss of agricultural land in itself We don't have any policy to support a refusal on that. It's only best and most valuable agricultural land, which the site is not. So I would recommend against that, but obviously it's a decision for the committee. In relation to loss of trees, there isn't any technical concern with regards to loss of trees. So the trees as assessed aren't considered worthy of TPO or special protection, but notwithstanding that, a landscape refusal reason would obviously be considering the impact on trees intrinsically as part of the landscape assessment. And in relation to overbearing effect of a garage, that's a matter of appearance and scale, which is reserved. The applicant has submitted indicative plans and elevations to give an idea of how the proposed dwellings could look, but that's not something which is for consideration as part of the application. It's as it were background indicative information. So in that respect, I wouldn't recommend a refusal reason with regards to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I just wanted to make sure they were aired in public and we'd consider those as our concerns. I mean, as the ward member, and I'm sure council followers will allow me, I know we have to go process of someone recommending the refusal, which we haven't done yet.
Will.
So when we get that, I would like to be that person. I'm sure councillor follows. And then if you would like to second when it comes, but when we get to that process, Chair.
Okay, so we move now to the proposal to object. Councillor Denis, you're going to propose it.
I am indeed, and I'm sure I'll have at least one person to second that.
Indeed, Madam Chair, thank you.
On the grounds that we've all understood. Yes, so all in favour of the proposal to reject, please show. And those against? And those abstaining?
Thank you, Chairman. That was 12 for, 1 against and 2 abstentions.
Thank you very much. So we have rejected that planning application, and I think that it is 9 minutes to 8. We should probably take a short comfort break before we go on to our second application. So let's gather again at 8 o'clock. Yep, we do. I didn't want to interrupt. If it's about football, you know, but we're all back in the room now. So we can move on to our second application of the evening, which is for Great Tangley Barns, Great Tangley Warnish. And the proposal is to create 2 dwelling houses and an erection of a double garage and studio. Over to you, Carl.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. This application is for the alterations to the existing barn to create 2 dwellings along with the erection of an outbuilding and garage following the demolition of an existing stable at Great Tangley Barns. The site is situated in the Greenbelt and AGLV, whilst also has a Grade 1 listed structure, Great Tangley Manor, situated to the southwest. This site is accessed by Bridleway 300. This slide shows the aerial photo of the wider area with the site under the red pin and Great Tangley Manors with the pink pin. The land is mostly open, comprising of fields to the north and east and a cluster of development to the south. Photo A is taken adjacent to the proposed northernmost access, looking south down the Bridleway. The existing barn is seen on the right and is a single-storey structure with a low roof profile. Photo B is taken from the southern access, looking again down the Bridleway. The dwelling of Tangley Mead is visible, which is the closest neighbour. Photo C is taken from inside the site, looking towards the existing barn. And photo D shows the stable building to be demolished. So the proposed site plan demonstrates the barn will be divided in the middle into 2 dwellings. The dwellings will both be for 3-bed units, with the garage serving unit 1 and an outbuilding serving unit 2. This slide shows the proposed and existing western elevations. As you can see, there'll be no enlargement to the barn, just alterations to make it habitable. And this is the same again with the eastern elevation. So this slide shows the at the bottom the existing stable structure to be demolished and the proposed garage and outbuilding above it. As you can see, the proposed buildings remain low in profile and with a smaller footprint than the stable to be demolished. So the main matters of consideration is the location of development, the impact on the greenbelt, the impact on visual amenity, the impact on the nearby heritage assets, the impact of the AGLV, impact on neighbouring amenity and the parking provisions. Based on the assessment outlined in the committee report, officers are recommending this application for approval. And just to confirm, following the update sheet, this recommendation is subject to approval to subject to conditions 1 to 8 and informatives 1 to 3. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And now we have some public speaking. May I call upon Mr. Davis, please?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tim Davis. Before I start, I'd just like to introduce myself and say that I've lived in Great Tangley for over 30 years, and I was surprisingly the only resident that was written to by Waverley concerning this proposal. I wish to object to this planning proposal as it will constitute an excessive build in an inappropriate environment, be to the detriment of all the current residents of Great Tangley and also of the numerous users of the bridle path. The path extends from the Warnish-Shalford Road to the exit near the Chilworth level crossing. Some background facts here. As you've heard, this hamlet is flanked by a historic manor house which attracts visitors and paying guests. It is situated on a fully working farm. The hamlet is only served by a single track bridle path with some designated passing places. Traffic levels are already presenting real problems to all of us. In fact, I at my house am sometimes blocked in or out by fuel deliveries and other deliveries like that. The users of the path include large numbers of horse riders, cyclists, increasingly, runners and walkers of all kinds. There are also charity events relating to these pursuits. Post-pandemic, the volume of use has totally spiraled. This is an important point for you all to consider. The upkeep of the bridleway is maintained by the Great Tangley Residents Association and the owners of the farm. However, the costs are escalating due to the damage caused by the increases in traffic. Great Tangley has, in terms of dwellings, expanded by 33% during the last 6 years. And if this proposal is approved, that expansion would be nearer 50% within 7 years. Our vehicles are suffering in consequence. The worry is that the delicate balance of Great Tangley is being put under pressure that its infrastructure cannot sustain. There are safety issues here that have been increasing in recent years. So you will see that the prospect of 2 new dwellings with its attendant buildings further up the bridleway is a deeply unattractive prospect. The amount of extra strain applied to the bridleway would be colossal. There is already subsidence in certain areas on the bridleway. Furthermore, this is a fundamental change of use being requested. That is the change from agricultural use to residential use. What is the justification for such a change on a site surrounded by a farm, our paddock, which is a home to 2 horses, and a sand school used for dressage, training and exercise? This is an agricultural setting in an area of outstanding natural beauty and not an area of outstanding overdevelopment due to planning decisions. How can the actual work, when it goes ahead, how can it be confined within the borders of the site? How can the work proceed in such an environment with such limited space available? Will the bridleway have to be closed? On a personal level, the safety of our horses, where they live only inches away from the development, what will happen to them over the time that this is taking place? If completed, how will the safety and welfare of the horses be affected by the large amount of glass reflecting back into their faces from this new development? The building density and the light refraction are serious issues here. So I feel that this is totally inappropriate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. And now I call upon Mr. Douglas to speak. He's on Zoom. Mr. Douglas.
Good evening, Chairman. Thank you for letting me speak. I'm the agent and a chartered town planner. The purpose of the application is to provide a viable conversion of these existing farm buildings, creating a new use that retains and sensitively converts them to residential use. The farm buildings have not been used for agricultural purposes for some time. It's better to give these buildings new life than let them become unused and derelict. The proposal is similar to the applications at Great Tangley Manor Farm, which is about 100 metres to the south. These applications granted by this committee in 2011 and 2014 allowed the existing barns to be converted to 4 dwellings under similar policy circumstances to those before you now. The proposal is to convert the buildings to 2 new houses, and this will prevent them falling into disrepair. Furthermore, the proposals provide an opportunity for the applicants to live on the site that their family has owned for many years. The reuse of rural buildings is recognised to be a sustainable and efficient use of developed land, and this prevents them from becoming derelict and prone to vandalism. This reuse does not prejudice the openness of the green belt, as the buildings already exist. Paragraph 150E of the NPPF tells us that this form of development is not inappropriate, and policy RD2 of your plan defers back to national guidance on this subject. The County Highway Authority and County Rights of Way Authority have no objection to the proposed development in terms of traffic levels, highway safety, or parking, which is self-contained on the site. The applicant has an unfettered right of access to the site. The level of traffic would be no greater than if the building should be reused for agriculture. The existing site is well landscaped from its neighbours by gardens and intervening features. The nearest residential properties are sufficiently distant and there are no direct views that would cause a loss of privacy. Policy RD7 of the local plan, which is still in use, confirms that the reuse of rural buildings is acceptable. In this instance, the proposal meets all the criteria set by your policy. Your professional officers have recommended approval on sound planning analysis of the proposal against current policy. They have considered that it is well designed and in keeping with the context of the area, whilst not harming the setting of nearby listed buildings. As with the previous application, the tilted balance set out in paragraph 11 of the NPPF should also apply, although I've heard the arguments put forward by your members. Accordingly, we consider that this application complies with the policies of your development plan and the NPPF, and I commend it highly to you. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Douglas. And now I call upon Lisa Davidson, who speaks on behalf of Wonersh Parish Council. Also on.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. So I'm speaking on behalf of the council, who still hold the view that they did in their earlier objection with reference to the evidence of the change of use and the erosion of the green belt as such, and did also express some concerns about access to and from the site during construction and beyond. I appreciate decisions are made on a case-by-case basis, but the council do have some concerns about this being a trend locally and the impact that that could have more widely as well. I've heard obviously earlier discussion about RE3 and the extent to which the EGLV is treated more or less like OMB, but the same principles for protecting the AONB will apply to the area of greater landscape value. And in similar applications to this, the AONB officer has kind of made comments that could well apply in this case as well. But I appreciate that is a different case. So thank you. That's all I need to say today. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Members, Councillor Goodridge.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for this coming before the committee. We are dealing with another hamlet, this time a smaller hamlet than Cox's Green, and that this hamlet is very small indeed. And as you've heard, Tangley Mead is the nearest house, and to get to the site you have to pass quite a large area after you leave the hamlet. Then you get to Tangley Mead, then you get another field, and then you get to this site. I visited the site, and to say that we want to stop it being derelict, well, it is pretty derelict now. That is going to be demolished is, in my view, is nearly demolished itself already. I mean, I've lived in the village over 30 years, and I'm not aware that these barns have been used over that period. And I find it odd on the statement that the development would retain the existing access, which would result in a likely reduction of vehicle movements to the site. Well, at the moment, and for the last living memory, there's been no traffic movements that site at all. To reduce nothing, to say that you're going to reduce nothing to less than nothing does seem a little strange. Mention was made that in the same hamlet, I think that the applicant was saying there have been conversion of barns. There were a very different situation there because those barns were all listed. And they were listed barns which, if they hadn't been used and converted into dwellings, would have seriously deteriorated. The barns well, you don't call them barns. It's a load of breeze blocks in a row, and the materials at the moment in that property are not attractive, to say the least. And presumably they will remain unattractive if we're going to use, if they're not going to knock it down and rebuild it, which is what I understand will not happen. It will not be knocked down. They will just adapt the building that's there. The access through a bridleway, I mean, it is a narrow bridleway, and the only way you can turn around in that bridleway on that section is to go into someone's drive and turn around that way. I mean, it's a single track, and very much a single track. When you get that far down, when you go beyond Tangley Mead. I mean, the parish council have expressed concern about losing barns to dwelling houses, and I appreciate there's no such thing as a precedent in planning, as I'm sure our chief planning officer would tell us, but there are others in the pipeline in the village, and it is thought that, you know, this is a serious situation where you can have an old barn, you let it fall down, you then put houses in it, and before you know what's happened, hamlets start spreading. And this certainly spread the hamlet towards Chilworth, which is undesirable. And therefore I am concerned about it. I appreciate that planning reasons will be thin, except that it comes down to interpretation of whether this, there was the situation as to whether it is remote or not. I'm just trying to find the paragraph, whether it's isolated or not. And there was the recent appeal decision in Braintree, with the definition of an isolated home was brought into question. And it said that the defendants in that definition should be taken as that stated in the Oxford Concise English Dictionary, far away from other places, buildings, or remote. And I would say this is remote, so far as the use of the English language of the Oxford Concise Dictionary. It's not within a cluster of buildings as such in this situation. It is linear, 100 meters, 200 meters away from the 100 meters away from the nearest building, and that in turn is another 100 meters away from the cluster of buildings that form Great Tangley Hamlet. So I wished to raise this because I am concerned about this being a precedent, and I'm concerned that this is not the right place to put a dwelling, or even two dwellings.
Thank you, Councillor Goodridge. Councillor Cossar.
Thank you, Chair. I don't want to make a comment on the application though, but I do want to understand something, and that's on page 48, relevant planning history. We seem to have had an application in 1987 for the erection of 3 dwellings, which was refused, and then more recently in 2014 an application for change of use to 4 dwellings, which was actually given permission. Now there's some indication in all of this that certainly with the latter it's not necessarily on exactly the same site, but the thing I'm finding very difficult is normally when we're given relevant planning history, we're then told that this is a consideration and some explanation is offered. And I think before I do take a view on this, I would like to understand how far these planning applications, which we've been given information about, are or are not on the same site and or are not relevant to this particular application. It's just a gap that normally I expect to see, and if we haven't got it there, I wonder if we could perhaps have some information now from officers. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cossar. Carl.
Thank you, Chair. So the 2014 one's just located sort of to the south of the site, sort of more within the sort of cluster, and it's sort of in there as a recent sort of material material considerations that were made in a similar planning context to what you're considering today. So for example, policy RD7 would have been utilised then just as it is in this application now. So that one would, if it's more, potentially could attribute a bit more weight to that one in as a material consideration. If you're looking at the 87 permission, which I unfortunately don't have the red line in front of me, this is obviously predating the 2002 plan, so it's a sort of different context, but it is there just as it is a relevant consideration. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
I'll just come back very briefly. I think I understood that, but we're being told that we're being given this almost as a context rather than the relevant, planning and material consideration. Is that the case? Because it doesn't, what you seem to be saying is it's outside the site. So it's not like many we consider in which it's an application on the same site, and clearly the difference is, and indeed in some cases we've dealt with applications, of course, where we didn't give this permission, there's an extant permission anyway.
Zach.
Yeah, I think Councillor Costa's got a fair point there, and perhaps where we're putting things in for context, we should be clearer about that. It's a very, very valid point. I think the 2014 one compared to the 1987, there are various differences. Obviously, we've had various local plans since 1987, but more importantly, the MPPF in 2012 brought in the sort of principle of being able to convert dwellings convert buildings in the green belt as not being inappropriate, provided it doesn't have a greater impact on openness. And so the 2014 decision, which was to allow the change of use to 4 dwellings, was taken in the context of that updated national position. Before 2012, that there was much stricter restrictions on conversions in the green belt.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. One very quick.
Certainly.
Do we know, and I understand if you don't, whether the commission
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, yes, it has. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We have Councillor Baker. Yep, Councillor Baker, and then Councillor Denis, and I've got the next 2. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Well, I have a similar question to put, because I think what concerns me is there may now be policy that permits the reuse of agricultural buildings, even if they've been permitted initially on grounds of agricultural need. And this worries me. I'm not talking about listed agricultural buildings. I'm talking about any old at-cost type things. And because I have difficulties with the justification for converting agricultural buildings if they were permitted on grounds of agricultural need. So could I have an answer to that?
I'm guessing that you're referring to these prior approvals for new agricultural buildings, that so people can put up agricultural buildings in the countryside, provided they can demonstrate their agricultural need. And then there is a concern that they will then come along a few years later and convert them. I don't think that applies to this building, because the building's been there for quite some time and wouldn't have been erected under the sort of the more recent provisions. So we're really just looking at a building that's been in existence for some time and has been part of the countryside environment there for many years, and now it's whether or not the conversion would be acceptable. And in principle, under the MPPF and our policies, in principle it would.
Okay, now I do have, if I may, another question. How long have the buildings not been functioning? Do we know?
I don't know the exact number of years, but I think it's from the photos and from my site visit, it's a fairly substantial time. I don't have the exact number, but from the visit and from how it appears, it's not part of a sort of functioning unit anymore. Chair.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Denis, please.
Thank you. And just to show Councillor Darcy my green credentials, I see there isn't any charging points on this. So I think we should be asking for that, should we approve? Oh, is it? Oh, I've got so many updates. That's the problem, there's so many updates. I mean, we've talked about AGLV, but of course this is green belt as well. And we've got listed buildings. So the first question, which is probably very easy to answer, under 6, County Highway Authority requires further information. If you tell me it's on the update, fine. It's probably the update I've yet to receive, right, fine. But I have to admit, I don't particularly like the design. I know they've got, you know, when you look at it, you think, is that the best you could do? Little windows, and I just didn't think for a green belt it was particularly impressive. I know you can only build on what you've got, but just like the, you know, I just didn't like it personally. I haven't really seen justification to turn from agricultural to dwellings. I'd have liked to have seen a little bit more. But the thing that does concern me, and it's under point 10, which is in a sustainable location. So it says the day-to-day needs will be either in Wonersh 1.6 or Shalford 2.2, so quite a distance. But it doesn't consider that would be unsustainable and car dependent. Well, are people going to be walking down that little pathway 2.2 kilometres to Shalford? I think it is going to be car reliant, and I think to say it's not, I'm quite surprised. I haven't made up my mind on this one, and I'm willing to hear what other people say. I have concerns, but I really would like to hear what my colleagues say before making my decision. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Denis. We have Councillor Darcy, followed by Councillor Hegan, followed by Councillor Gale.
Thank you. The question, I want to ask a quick question, which was, and then I'll say something else. According to the update, the northern access is to be reinstated. And I just wondered if you could show us on the map what is meant by the northern access.
So the northern access is this one here, so on the right hand side. So if I go back the photos as well. So if we go back to the location actually, so it's just up here. Yeah, that's where the access would be.
So does that mean you're talking about the access to the actual site from the bridleway?
Yes, yeah.
So is that where the visibility spays are going to be?
Yes, so the county, so there's an existing access which is sort of clearly in use, and then there's a sort of historic access, the northern one, which the Highway Authority required visibility space for because it hasn't been used for some time, and they've been provided and found acceptable by the Highway Authority.
Okay, that's interesting. So who's responsible for this bridleway? Is it the Highways Authority?
I'm not particularly sure who specifically is, but the Highway Authority and the rights of way at county haven't objected to the access for the development.
Yeah, I'm just a bit puzzled because normally they only deal with public highway, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, there's the development management transport, one that we normally consult with, but there's also a public rights of way officer. And I think what Carl was saying was that both were consulted and raised no objections.
But then you wouldn't expect the highways too, if it's not a public highway, would you?
I guess looking at the space from a technical point of view, they sort of have the technical knowledge to understand if they're acceptable, which they found they did, and they did have the shorter 2 meter visibility space that required on public rights of way like this one. Thank you.
Okay. I'm still a bit confused because I'm sure we've had many occasions when we've talked about highways not commenting because it was private. However, let's go over that.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say that they commented on the basics of bridleway. It's a public right of way. So
yeah, but that's the public rights. That's the rights of way officer, not the highways.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah,
yeah, which is a completely different thing.
Yeah, no, yeah, I see what you're saying.
Just want to clarify that. So I also agree with Councillor Denis. When I heard the spokesman describe it as a good design, I must admit I was a bit surprised, because basically it's just an oblong, isn't it, that they've cut in half and stuck a few windows in. It's pretty unattractive, I have to say, and not very inspiring. However, that's not a reason necessarily to say no to it. It does seem to me that the location does fit the definition of remote, being as it's on the end of a long, thin bridleway that isn't actually a public highway, and it's on its own. Even, you know, there are some other houses, but they're some distance away. So I think it is isolated, and I think we're not supposed to be encouraging isolated dwellings. Is that correct?
Thank you, Councillor Darcy. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the isolated points, we've made those in our report. Actually, it's a judgment in terms of whether it's kind of near other kind of buildings and the like. But even if you were to say that it was isolated, I think what's important is that you're aware of what it says in the MPPF about isolated homes. So it says in paragraph 80 that planning policies and decisions should avoid isolated homes in the countryside unless one of the following circumstances applies. And there is there's A and B, which wouldn't apply to this, but C, it does say that the development would reuse redundant or disused buildings and enhance its setting. So our view is that it isn't isolated, but even if you took the view that it was isolated, you would have to, it wouldn't necessarily just mean that it would be unacceptable. You would have to give consideration to whether it would actually meet one of those other criteria when you would allow an isolated dwelling. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Hegan, followed by Councillor Gale. Councillor Hegan.
Thank you, Chair. I found the officer's report quite well constructed and persuasive, and I haven't heard, although I've listened to the comments of other councillors, that's not changed that view. I mean, I think it's an ugly building. It's an eyesore at the moment. It's in the green belt. It doesn't add to the beauty. And I quite liked the design as something that was just in keeping with what it is currently and has minimal extra features that would detract from the setting. So I'm actually quite in favour of this application.
Thank you very much. Councillor Gale.
Thank you, Chair. We've seen quite a few bits and pieces of barns that have been turned into habitable accommodation in various areas. And usually people are doing it because they're extending the living accommodation for a farm or something like that. But the gentleman that sort of proposed this, the only thing I could hear him say was, as the barns have not been used and they might fall down, they might as well make them into houses. It didn't really ring with me that this was a necessity. If they're bothered about the barns falling down, well, then take them down. And they are an eyesore. Isolated, yes. Reuse of redundant buildings, maybe, but they're not really redundant buildings. They're just a tumble down shack at the moment. They haven't been used for many, many years. I just think it's a bit inappropriate, really, with light in that setting. What's going to happen about sewage and waste and all those sort of things? How is the tipper lorry going to get there to empty their wheelie bins? It's just a bridleway. It's going to be overused from what it's being used at the moment, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the applicant is going to be living in one of the units.
Yeah, I would say that's not necessarily a relevant planning consideration. What's more relevant is the test in the green belt about what forms of development are not inappropriate and provided they preserve openness and do not conflict with the purposes of including land in the green belt. And one of those is the reuse of buildings, provided the buildings are of permanent and substantial construction. So it really comes down to that test of if they're of permanent and substantial construction, then the green belt argument falls away. Obviously, that's a judgment call on that. And the isolated dwellings test, I think Chris and Carl addressed quite well, in that even if we were to conclude that it was isolated, the conversion of the building is one of those exceptions that could be allowed under paragraph 80. So I think it's covered both ways, Councillor Gale, but it's not me, again, it's not me making a decision.
Councillor Reid.
So soon, thank you. Two things, and I feel I'm really speaking with the influence of Councillor Darcy, but I am a Green Liberal Democrat and I feel I can speak on this. Two things, yes. There doesn't seem to be anything about the Great Crested Newt here, because if you look at that plan that we have, our application plan, there seems to be, I think it's a lake. Is it a lake? Yes. So there doesn't seem any, there are no details about looking after the reptiles or even trees or any other creatures that might be around. So I'd like a comment on that if it's possible. And the other thing was, there was a little statement about noise from a heat pump. So I'd like an explanation on that, please.
Carl.
With regards to the Great Crested Newts, there was an ecology report submitted. I can't remember off the top of my head if it was sort of comprehensive or just for bats, so we'll double check that with you. But okay, yeah, so it's a completely sort of hard standing area. I think with a few that it would sort of be having an acceptable sort of impact there. And then with the heat pump, there's a condition limiting the noise that could be emitted from the heat pump, should permission be granted. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of questions, one observation. Having looked at the photographs, or what photographs were there, they bear very little or no relation to the plans of the barn and the stables. It looks a complete and utter mess, and to my mind, that would be more of a rebuild than it would be a conversion. And the other point that came to mind was, okay, it's 2.2 miles from Shalford, it's 1.6 miles from, it's down an unlit bridle path. How many times are people going to be able to walk that distance? I think you are talking about considerable traffic. I think apart from in the middle of summer, it's going to be either too dark, too wet, or too slippy to go down a bridle path. So that is a concern too. But I think they could improve the design. I mean, even if we allowed them to build a mock barn, it would look at on-site better than the description we've got here. And that's the end of my observations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Carl, did you want to speak?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So for the barn building, which is being reused, so there's a structural report which does confirm that it is of substantial enough construction to be reused. The stable building to be demolished is not in the same condition, but it is being demolished. So yeah, we're satisfied that the building being reused can be reused. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Goodridge, please.
Yes, just 2 points. I mean, I think on the planning history, looking at the planning, the description on page 48, that did relate to the barns that were listed. So it's a very different kettle of fish than and is off the site plan. It would be further down and off that plan. And if you're converting, and I think I'm right in saying these barns were for pigs originally, if you start with a barn for pigs, you're not going to end up with a very beautiful building. And the idea is to convert the barns, not rebuild them. So you get what you get. And I would accept that they, not that I'm any expert on buildings, but they looked, the one that's being retained didn't show any signs of falling down. On what had been built with breeze blocks was still up with breeze blocks, but everything else looked fairly tatty around it. So, I mean, my problem, I wanted obviously to raise the thing before the committee, but I accept that with the planning policy we've got, I can't come up with a good planning reason actually to refuse it, one has to say, because they are redundant buildings, there's no doubt about that at all. And the one thing that I, questioned was the fact that there was going to be a reduction of vehicle movements. But as the bridle authority, highway authority, and everyone else seems happy with it, I'm not going to get much mileage out of that either. But the previous application that was dealt with in 2014 specifically put in a passing pace. Now that was between Great Tangley and the road, so that they're not going to get any benefit from that parking or overtaking space or passing space. I am concerned that when you get to the hamlet itself, where the houses are, and there's only a dozen or so dwellings there, slightly more, a dozen roughly. There's no turning round area after that. So refuse lorries will have to reverse, presumably all the way up the bridleway, past Tangley Mead to get to the to remove the refuse from the other houses that are being proposed. It's undesirable, and I suspect there'll be damage to the bridleway. But as the bridleway officer seems to be happy with it, and the highway seem to be happy with it, I accept that there's no point raising a spurious planning reason to refuse, because I can't think of one. I wish I could.
Thank you, Councillor Goodrich. Councillor Cotter, followed by Councillor Sadler. Councillor Cotter.
Thank you very much, Chair. Councillor Goodrich has stolen the words out of my mouth. I was going to say I wanted to listen to the debate, because when I read the report, I couldn't think of any substantial reasons either on which to turn this down. And I think, to be honest with you, we've been scratching around in the debate. I mean, when we start talking about considerable traffic, for two houses, I understand the point, but with the highways officer and the bridleway officer as well not making any comment on that, I just think that would look rather ludicrous, to be honest. And my own view is, I think the same as Councillor Hegan. I think the case is made quite simply in the report, and I think we should agree the proposal.
Thank you, Councillor Cotter. Councillor Sadler.
Hi, yes, thank you, Chair. I would just say, from a practical point of view, the construction traffic will sort out the access roads, and they will find ways of creating turns. So I don't think there'll be any issue.
Thank you very much. Councillor Denis.
It's just a question actually for the team. When Surrey Highways look at an application, it's normally done on safety grounds. They don't often look at the damage it could be caused, and same with the bridleway. So I wonder whether we could put a condition, and I have seen this before, where it puts an obligation for them to keep the bridleway in the condition that it was before construction started. So if immense damage is caused, then they have to reinstate it. And then, at least I'll be a little bit happier, because I can't find of any other ground. So can we do that, please?
Yep, Carl.
Yes, in the update sheet, in the construction transport management plan, point E says before and after construction condition survey of the highway, and a commitment to fund the repair of any damage caused as part of the condition.
So can we include highway and bridleways and any, because they might have slightly different definitions, just to make sure we cover them all.
Okay. So I don't see any more speakers. Oh, Councillor Baker.
Yes, just coming back, Madam Chair, on that last point. I'd like to have something put in there that resulted in prompt repair of any damage caused. Time is of the essence, I think. Is that possible, please?
Sorry,
Yes,
Chairman.
please do.
Sorry, through you. We wouldn't put that in the condition necessarily, but if members felt sufficiently strongly, we could do an informative that says, in respect of condition X, the council's expectation would be that any repairs would be done promptly following completion of the development or something like that. I mean, it's an informative rather than a condition, but we're happy to do that if it's the wish of the committee.
Okay, so shall we move to the recommendation that permission be granted subject to the conditions and informatives as set out in the update sheet? Councillors, will you please indicate whether you are in favour of granting this permission, please? And those against? And those abstaining?
Thank you, Chairman. That was 10 for, none against and 5 abstentions.
Thank you very much. So my vice chairman challenged us to finish before it was dark. It isn't dark. And so we finished the meeting. Thank you.